Take another drink. That's what a soldier said to an 18-year-old girl while she was drowning. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. She was underwater. They pulled her out, half-conscious, coughing up the sea, and before she could even get a full breath in, someone asked her one more time to say 6 words that would let her live. She had already watched a woman die 10 minutes earlier, tied to a stake, 20 feet in front of her, close enough to hear every sound. Close enough that when the water reached the older woman's mouth, Margaret Wilson heard exactly what drowning sounds like, and they made her watch on purpose. Here's the part that should bother you. This wasn't an accident of history. This wasn't chaos. Someone planned this. Someone stood on a beach in Scotland, looked at a teenage girl, and calculated exactly where to place 2 wooden stakes so that she would be forced to watch someone else die first. As a warning. As a preview. As a threat with a face on it. So the question isn't just, what happened to Margaret Wilson? The question is, what does it take to break an 18-year-old girl? And why didn't it work? Because it should have worked. Everything about that day was built to make her say 6 words and walk home. The water was cold. Her family was somewhere in that crowd. She was young enough that nobody would have blamed her for giving in. She didn't. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what she said back to the man who told her to take another drink, word for word, in the moment she said it, with the water still in her lungs. But to understand why those words came out of an 18-year-old's mouth, instead of a scream, instead of a surrender, instead of silence, you have to understand what was done to her family for 4 straight years before she ever saw that beach. Because this didn't start with a stake in the sand. It started with a door that wouldn't open. Rewind 25 years. A king named Charles II sits back down on the throne of Scotland after years in exile. And the first thing he does, the very first thing, is decide that he's not just the king of the country. He wants to be the king of the church too. Not supports the church, not protects the church, owns it, runs it, sits at the top of it, above the ministers, above the Bible itself if it comes down to it. There's a problem with that. Decades earlier, the people of Scotland had signed something called the National Covenant, a written, sworn, public promise that no king, no bishop, no crown would ever sit above Christ as head of the church. They didn't sign it quietly. They signed it in blood-serious terms, some of them literally in their own blood, because that's how seriously they meant it. So when Charles II declares himself head of the church anyway, he's not just changing policy, he's asking an entire nation to break an oath they made to God. Around 300 ministers refuse, on the spot. They walk out of their own churches, buildings they built, congregations they raised, salaries they depended on, and they never go back. And here's what nobody tells you about what happens next. It wasn't just the ministers who paid for that. Their congregations followed them out the door, which meant, overnight, thousands of ordinary Scottish families were suddenly worshipping illegally. Not doing anything violent, not plotting anything, just meeting outdoors, in fields, in hidden valleys, to sing and pray and hear a sermon from a minister the government had banned. They called these gatherings conventicles. The government called them crimes. Attending one was punishable. Preaching at one could get you killed. And as the years dragged on, historians call this stretch the killing time for a reason. The punishments stopped being fines and started being executions, public ones, on purpose. Because a quiet execution doesn't scare anyone, and the government needed people scared. This is the world Margaret Wilson was born into, a farm called Glen Vernoch, in the hills of Galloway, southwest Scotland, sometime around 1667. Her father, Gilbert, made the calculation, a lot of parents made in that decade. He went to the official church. He said the words the law required. Maybe he believed none of it. Maybe he believed all of it. Nobody knows what was in his heart. But outwardly, he complied, because a farm doesn't run itself, and a family doesn't eat on principle alone. His children made a different calculation. Margaret, her younger brother, Thomas, her little sister Agnes, who at this point was still basically a child. They looked at the same law their father obeyed, and they said, no. And here's the detail that should stop you for a second. Margaret wasn't some radical firebrand. She wasn't a preacher's daughter raised on fire and rhetoric. She was a farm girl. She gathered sheep. She helped bring in the harvest. She sat by a fire on winter nights, the same as every other teenager in Galloway. So where did this come from? Somewhere in that ordinary childhood, something took root that the law could not touch, and the government could not legislate out of her. And it was about to cost her everything. When Margaret, Thomas, and Agnes refused to attend the King's Church, they didn't just become unpopular, they became fugitives. In their own country, on their own family's land. Think about what that actually means, day to day. It means you can't sleep in your own bed. It means you're checking the tree line before you walk into a clearing. It means the moors and the caves of Galloway, cold, wet, exposed, become safer to you than your own house, because soldiers know where your house is, and their father couldn't help them. Not because he didn't want to, because the law made it a crime for him to try. Soldiers were quartered on Gilbert Wilson's farm as punishment. Fines were levied against him, again and again, for the crime of raising children who wouldn't conform. He was being financially bled dry for a decision he never made. Picture that man at night, knowing his daughters are out on the moor in the cold, knowing that if he opens his door to them, he could lose the farm, and they could lose their lives. What do you do with that? There's no version of that choice that doesn't hurt. Out on those hills, though, something else was happening. The hunted found each other. Fugitive families, hiding in the same glens, started meeting in secret. Not to plot, not to fight, just to do the thing they'd been criminalized for doing in the first place. Pray. Sing psalms low enough that the sound wouldn't carry. Listen to a hunted minister preach for 20 minutes before everyone scattered again. And in those gatherings, one passage came up again and again. Romans chapter 8, the part that asks, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Tribulation, distress, persecution, sword, and answers itself, nothing. Not death, not life, nothing in all creation. People memorized that, not as poetry, as a survival document, because they needed it to be true. Margaret carried those words with her onto the sand, years later. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew, in early 1685, was that things were about to get worse, because the king who'd been enforcing all of this had just died, and his replacement was about to make everything before this look gentle. King Charles II dies in February 1685. His brother James takes the throne. For one brief moment, some of the hunted families let themselves hope. New king, maybe new mercy. Instead, James rolls out something worse than anything that came before it. The abjuration oath. Here's what made this one different. Before, you had to be caught doing something. Attending a conventicle, hiding a minister, refusing to pay a fine. Now, the government didn't need you to do anything at all. They could stop you, on the road, in the market, at your own front door, and demand, right there, on the spot, that you swear an oath renouncing certain covenanter declarations and, depending on how it was worded, acknowledging the king's authority over matters that, in the covenanter's eyes, belonged to Christ alone. refuse, and in the worst cases, you didn't even get a trial. You could be shot where you stood. Think about what that does to a person's nervous system. Every stranger on the road is now a potential executioner with a piece of paper. Every knock at the door could be the last conversation you have. This is the exact climate, the most dangerous stretch of the entire killing time, that Margaret Wilson, now about 18, walked into. After months hiding in the hills, Margaret and her 13-year-old sister Agnes came down into the town of Wigtown, quietly, to see friends, fellow believers. Among them, an elderly widow named Margaret McLachlan, a woman in her 60s, known around Kirkener Parish for her devotion, who had also refused to conform. They thought they were being careful. They had no idea a trap was already closing around them. His name was Patrick Stewart, and the two sisters trusted him. He struck up a conversation, friendly, easy, the kind of talk you don't think twice about. And then he did something small, almost throwaway. He invited them to drink to the king's health. It sounds harmless. It wasn't. In 1685, Galloway, raising a glass to the king, was a loyalty test, disguised as a social nicety. Everyone in that room knew what refusing meant. Margaret and Agnes declined, politely, firmly. The way you decline something you know is a trap, hoping declining quietly is enough. It wasn't. Stewart didn't need a confession. He had his answer the moment they said no. He walked straight to the authorities. Within hours, soldiers came for both sisters, ages 18 and 13, and around the same time, they picked up the widow, Margaret McLachlan, too. Some accounts say she was arrested on her knees, mid-prayer. All three were thrown into a cell the townspeople called the Thieves' Hole. Not a courtroom holding cell. A pit reserved for the worst criminals in the region, dark, filthy, cold. A 63-year-old widow and two teenage girls, locked in with hardened criminals, because they wouldn't say a king's name where God's name belonged. Now sit with this for a second, because it matters for what comes next. One conversation. One friendly-seeming man. One drink they wouldn't raise. That's the entire distance between an ordinary afternoon and a death sentence. How fast can your whole life change because of one person you trusted? For Margaret Wilson, the answer was instantly, and it was about to get a lot faster. April 13th, 1685. The three women are marched in front of a commission of judges. Some of the names in that room were already infamous across Galloway. Sir Robert Grierson of Lag chief among them, a man whose cruelty would follow his name for generations after his death. Alongside him, Major Windram, Captain Strachan, the provost of Wigtown. The charges read out loud were frankly absurd. The women were accused of taking part in two Covenanter battles, Bothwell Bridge and Aird's Moss, and of attending more than 20 illegal field meetings. Here's the problem. Margaret would have been around 12 years old when Bothwell Bridge happened. Agnes would have been about 7. Nobody in that courtroom believed a 12-year-old fought in a battle. That's not what this trial was about. This trial was never about establishing facts. It was about extracting submission. The charges were theater. The verdict was the point. The judges offered all three the same way out. Swear the abjuration oath, right now, and walk free. The widow refused. Margaret refused. Even 13-year-old Agnes, a child, refused. Read that again. A 13-year-old girl, in front of the most feared judges in the region, said no. The sentence came down. Margaret McLachlan and Margaret Wilson would be tied to stakes within the floodline of the water near Wigtown, and left there while the tide came in. Death by drowning. Slow, public, impossible to look away from, which was exactly the point. A message written in fear for every family watching. Agnes, because of her age, was spared the same sentence, but only because her father, Gilbert, put up an amount of money that would have crippled most Galloway farmers, just to buy his youngest daughter's life back. And then he did something almost unthinkable. He got on a horse and rode for Edinburgh, alone, to beg for the lives of the other two. What happened next should have saved them. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is the part of this story that should make you angriest. April 30th, 1685. In Edinburgh, the Privy Council, the highest authority Gilbert Wilson could appeal to, issues an order. It's still in the records today. You can go look at it. An order delaying the execution. A recommendation that both women be pardoned. Mercy, in writing, from the top of the government. 11 days later, on May 11th, soldiers came for both women anyway and marched them down to the sand as the tide was turning. 11 days. That reprieve had 11 days to travel from Edinburgh to Wigtown and stop an execution. And it didn't arrive in time. Or it arrived and was ignored. Or it was deliberately sat on by men in Galloway who wanted this execution to happen, no matter what a piece of paper from the capital said. Nobody can say for certain, even now, which one it was. But think about what that means if it's true. Somewhere, a piece of paper existed, right then, in that town, that could have stopped everything. And two women walked to a beach and died anyway. That's not a tragedy that happened because mercy didn't exist. That's a tragedy that happened because mercy existed and somebody let it sit in a drawer. Now picture that walk. The narrow streets of Wigtown. A crowd gathering along the way. Some weeping, some silent, some too afraid to even look. A woman in her 60s walking steadily toward the water because she'd already made her peace with this. And beside her, a girl of 18, who could still, right up until the very last second, say 6 words and turn around and walk home. She didn't turn around. 2 stakes, driven into the sand, and the placement wasn't random. This is the detail that tells you exactly what kind of cruelty planned this execution. Margaret McLachlan's stake was set farther out, deeper in the channel, where the tide would reach her first. Margaret Wilson's stake was set closer to shore, positioned so she would have no choice but to watch the older woman die before the water ever touched her. They didn't do that by accident. They did it because they were betting that watching someone drown would break the 18-year-old faster than her own fear of drowning ever could. The water came in. It reached the widow's feet, her knees, her waist. Witnesses who passed the story down said she didn't cry out for mercy from the men on shore. She endured it, committed herself to God, and went under without begging. And as she was struggling in the rising water, while she was still dying, one of the men on the beach called out to Margaret Wilson, mocking her, asking what she thought of the sight in front of her. He wanted her to answer with terror, with a scream, with the words that would end this. What she actually said has survived for over 300 years, word for word. What do I see but Christ in one of his members, wrestling there? Think ye that we are the sufferers? No, it is Christ in us, for he sends none a warfare on their own charges. She was watching her own death rehearsed in front of her, and she looked at it and said, "That's not suffering. That's Christ carrying someone through it." Then the water reached her, ankles, legs, and as it climbed, this 18-year-old girl, cold, terrified, minutes from death, did something nobody forced her to do. She sang Psalm 25, the old Scottish version, the one every Covenanter family in those hills had sung 100 times in secret gatherings on the moor. Words about lifting her soul to God, about not being ashamed, about trusting even now. The water kept rising, waist, chest. And then, this is the moment the entire video has been building to. The soldiers pulled her back up out of the water. Not out of mercy, out of strategy. They wanted one more shot at breaking her while she was weakest, soaked, gasping, half drowned, with the memory of the widow's death still fresh in front of her. The crowd pressed in. People who loved her were shouting for her to just say the words. Just say it, Margaret. Just say it and live. An officer, Major Windram, stepped forward and demanded she pray for the king and swear the oath. She was 18. She was freezing. Every instinct a human body has was screaming at her to survive. She answered that she wished the salvation of all men and the damnation of none. It wasn't the answer they wanted. Someone in the desperate crowd, trying to save her life for her, shouted out that she was willing to conform, practically begging her to just say, "God save the king," and be done with it. And the record says she gave them this instead: "God save him, if he will, for it is his salvation I desire." Still not the oath, still not surrender. A door left open for the king's soul, and nothing given away that belonged to Christ. That wasn't enough for them. They needed the full oath, the one that would put a crown on a man's head that she believed belonged to no one but Christ. And this is where she said the words that would follow her for the rest of history. "Now I will not. I am one of Christ's children. Let me go. Let me go. Not let me live." An officer told her to take another drink, and they pushed her back down. The tide of the Solway rolled in over Margaret Wilson, and an 18-year-old girl went from the cold, grey water of Scotland into whatever waits on the other side of a life given away on purpose. Both women were recovered and buried in the Wigtown churchyard. Their graves are still there. The stone over Margaret's grave says, plainly, that she was murdered for refusing to name any king but Christ as head of the church. Words carved so no one could soften what actually happened there. The men who ran that courtroom didn't get away clean either, not in the way that matters to history. Grierson of Lag became a name Scottish parents used to frighten children for a century after, and within 3 years, the entire regime that ordered this collapsed. King James was driven from the throne in 1688. The killing time ended. The church Margaret died refusing to abandon was restored. Today, there's a monument above Wigtown. A stone marker down near the water shows roughly where 2 stakes once stood. People still travel there, still stand in that spot. In 1871, a painter named John Everett Millais put her on canvas, a young woman bound at the wrist, eyes lifted, waiting for water that hasn't arrived yet in the painting, frozen forever, 1 second before it does. She never wrote a book, never preached a sermon. 18 years old, most of them spent on a farm nobody outside Galloway had ever heard of. And somehow, one sentence she said while watching a woman drown has outlasted every one of the men who killed her. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nobody's tying you to a stake this week. That's not how it works anymore. The tide doesn't come in loud now. It comes in quiet. A conviction you soften because it's easier. A line you move because everyone else already moved theirs. A faith diluted one small, reasonable-sounding compromise at a time, until one day there's nothing left underneath it that cost you anything at all. So, here's the only question this story actually leaves you with, and I'm not going to answer it for you. If the water started rising in your life tonight, not literal water, just pressure, just cost, just the moment where saying the true thing gets expensive, would you know, right now, what you'd refuse to say? Margaret Wilson knew. At 18, soaked, freezing, with a dead woman 20 feet in front of her, as proof of exactly what saying no would cost. She said it anyway. Let me go. Not let me live. Let me go.